Noli me Tangere by José RIZAL, Translator's Introduction, Part 1. We travel rapidly in these historical sketches. The reader flies in his express train in a few minutes through a couple of centuries. The centuries pass more slowly to those to whom the years are doled out day by day. Institutions grow and beneficently develop themselves, making their way into the hearts of generations which are shorter lived than they, attracting love and respect and winning loyal obedience, and then as gradually forfeiting by their shortcomings the allegiance which had been honorably gained in worthier periods. We see wealth and greatness, we see corruption and vice, and one seems to follow so close upon the other that we fancy they must have always coexisted. We look more steadily, and we perceive long periods of time in which there is first a growth, and then a decay, like that we perceive in a tree of the forest. Froude, Annals of an English Abbey. Monasticism's record in the Philippines presents no new general fact to the eye of history. The attempt to eliminate the eternal feminine from her natural and normal sphere in the scheme of things there met with the same certain and signal disaster that awaits every perversion of human activity. Beginning with a band of zealous, earnest men, sincere in their convictions, to whom the cause was all and their personalities nothing, it there, as elsewhere, passed through its usual cycle of usefulness, stagnation, corruption, and degeneration. To the unselfish and heroic efforts of the early friars, Spain in large measure owed her dominion over the Philippine Islands, and the Filipinos a marked advance on the road to civilization and nationality. In fact, after the dreams of sudden wealth from gold and spices had faded, the islands were retained chiefly as a missionary conquest and a stepping stone to the broader fields of Asia, with Manila as a depot for the Oriental trade. The records of those early years are filled with tales of courage and heroism worthy of Spain's proudest years, as the missionary fathers labored with unflagging zeal in disinterested endeavor for the spread of the faith and the betterment of the condition of the Malays among whom they found themselves. They won the confidence of the native peoples, gathered them into settlements and villages, led them into the ways of peace, and became their protectors, guides, and counselors. In those times, the cross and the sword went hand in hand, but in the Philippines the latter was rarely needed or used. The lightness and vivacity of the Spanish character, with its strain of Orientalism, its fertility of resource in meeting new conditions, its adaptability in dealing with the dwellers in warmer lands, all played their part in this, as in the other conquests. Only on occasions when some stubborn resistance was met with, as in Manila and the surrounding country, where the most advanced of the native peoples dwelt and where some of the forms and beliefs of Islam had been established, was it necessary to resort to violence to destroy the native leaders and replace them with the missionary fathers. A few sallies by young Salcedo, the Cortes of the Philippine conquest, with a company of the splendid infantry, which was at that time the admiration and despair of martial Europe, soon effectively exorcised any idea of resistance that even the boldest and most intransigent of the native leaders might have entertained. For the most part, no great persuasion was needed to turn a simple, imaginative, fatalistic people from a few vague animistic deities to the systematic iconology and the elaborate ritual of the Spanish Church. An obscure Bathala or a dim Malyari was easily superseded by or transformed into a clearly defined Dios, and in the case of any specially tenacious demon, he could without much difficulty be merged into a Christian saint or devil. There was no organized priesthood to be overcome, the primitive religious observances consisting almost entirely of occasional orgies presided over by an old woman, who filled the priestly offices of interpreter for the unseen powers and chief eater at the sacrificial feast. With their unflagging zeal, their organization, their elaborate forms and ceremonies, the missionaries were enabled to win the confidence of the natives, especially as the greater part of them learned the local language and identified their lives with the communities under their care. Accordingly, the people took kindly to their new teachers and rulers, so that in less than a generation, Spanish authority was generally recognized in the settled portions of the Philippines, and in the surrounding years the missionaries gradually extended this area by forming settlements from among the wilder peoples, whom they persuaded to abandon the more objectionable features of their old roving, often predatory life, and to group themselves into towns and villages under the bell. The tactics employed in the conquest and the subsequent behavior of the conquerors were true to the old Spanish nature, so succinctly characterized by a plain-spoken Englishman of Mary's reign, when the war cry of Castile encircled the globe and even hovered ominously near the sceptred isle, when in the intoxication of power character stands out so sharply defined. They be very wise and politic, and can, through their wisdom, perform and bridle their own natures for a time, and apply their conditions to the manners of those men with whom they meddle gladly by friendship, whose mischievous manners a man shall never know until he come under their subjection. But then shall he perfectly perceive and feel them, for in dissimulations until they have their purposes, and afterwards in oppression and tyranny, when they can obtain them, they do exceed all other nations upon the earth. In the working out of this spirit, with all the indomitable courage and fanatical ardor derived from the long contests with the Moors, they reduced the native peoples to submission, but still not to the galling yoke which they fastened upon the aborigines of America to make one Las Casas shine amid the horde of Pizarros. There was some compulsory labor in timber cutting and shipbuilding, with enforced military service as rowers and soldiers for expeditions to the Moluccas and the coasts of Asia, but nowhere the unspeakable atrocities which in Mexico, Hispaniola, and South America drove mothers to strangle their babies at birth, and whole tribes to prefer self-immolation to the living death in the mines and slave pens. Quite differently from the case in America, where entire islands and districts were depopulated to bring on later the curse of Negro slavery, in the Philippines the fact appears that the native population really increased and the standard of living was raised under the stern yet beneficent tutelage of the missionary fathers. The great distance and the hardships of the journey precluded the coming of many irresponsible adventurers from Spain, and, fortunately for the native population, no great mineral wealth was ever discovered in the Philippine Islands. The system of government was, in its essential features, a simple one. The missionary priests drew the inhabitants of the towns and villages about themselves or formed new settlements, and with profuse use of symbol and symbolism taught the people the faith, laying particular stress upon the fear of God as administered by them, reconciling the people to their subjection by inculcating the Christian virtues of patience and humility. When any recalcitrants refused to accept the new order or later showed an inclination to break away from it, the military forces, acting usually under secret directions from the padre, made raids in the disaffected parts with all the unpitying atrocity the Spanish soldiery were ever capable of displaying in their dealings with the weaker people. After sufficient punishment had been inflicted and a wholesome fear inspired, the padre very opportunely interfered in the natives' behalf, by which means they were convinced that peace and security lay in submission to the authorities, especially to the curate of their town or district. A single example will suffice to make the method clear. Not an isolated instance, but a typical case chosen from among the mass of records left by the chief actors themselves. Fray Domingo Perez, evidently a man of courage and conviction, for he later lost his life in the work of which he wrote, was the Dominican vicar on the Zambales coast when that order temporarily took over the district from the Recollects. In a report written for his superior in 1680, he outlines the method clearly. In order that those whom we have assembled in the 3 villages may persevere in their settlements, the most efficacious fear and the one most suited to their nature is that the Spaniards of the fort and presidio of Painaven, of whom they have a very great fear, may come very often to the said villages and overrun the land, and penetrate even into their old recesses where they formerly lived. And if perchance they should find anything planted in the said recesses, they would destroy it and cut it down without leaving them anything. And so that they may see the father protects them when the said Spaniards come to the village, the father opposes them and takes the part of the Indians. But it is always necessary in this matter for the soldiers to conquer, and the father is always very careful always to inform the Spaniards by whom and where anything is planted which it may be necessary to destroy, and that the edicts which his lordship the governor sent them be carried out. But at all events, said Spaniards are to make no trouble for the Indians whom they find in the villages, but rather must treat them well. This in 1680. The Dominican transcriber of the record in 1906 has added a very illuminating note, revealing the immutability of the system and showing that the rulers possessed in a superlative degree the Bourbonesque trait of learning nothing and forgetting nothing. Even when I was a missionary to the heathens from 1882 to 1892, I had occasion to observe the said policy, to inform the chief of the fortress of the measures that he ought to take, and to make a false show on the other side so that it might have no influence on the fortress. Thus it stands out in bold relief as a system built up and maintained by fraud and force, bound in the course of nature to last only as long as the deception could be carried on and the repressive force kept up to sufficient strength. Its maintenance required that the different sections be isolated from each other so that there could be no growth toward a common understanding and cooperation, and its permanence depended upon keeping the people ignorant and contented with their lot, held under strict control by religious and political fear. Yet it was a vast improvement over their old mode of life, and their condition was bettered as they grew up to such a system. Only with the passing of the years and the increase of wealth and influence, the ease and luxury invited by these, and the consequent corruption so induced, with the insatiable longing ever for more wealth and greater influence, did the poison of greed and grasping power enter the system to work its insidious way into every part, slowly transforming the beneficent institution of the 16th and 17th centuries into an incubus weighing upon all the activities of the people in the 19th, an unyielding bar to the development of the country, a hideous anachronism in these modern times. It must be remembered also that Spain, in the years following her brilliant conquests of the 15th and 16th century, lost strength and vigor through the corruption at home induced by the unearned wealth that flowed into the mother country from the colonies, and by the draining away of her best blood. Nor did her sons ever develop that economic spirit which is the permanent foundation of all empire, but they let the wealth of the Indies flow through their country, principally to London and Amsterdam, there to form in more practical hands the basis of the British and Dutch colonial empires. The priest and the soldier were supreme, so her best sons took up either the cross or the sword to maintain her dominion in the distant colonies, a movement which, long continued, spelled for her a form of national suicide. The soldier expended his strength and generally laid down his life on alien soil, leaving no fit successor of his own stock to carry on the work according to his standards. The priest, under the celibate system, in its better days left no offspring at all, and in the days of its corruption, none bred and reared under the influences that make for social and political progress. The dark chambers of the Inquisition stifled all advance in thought, so the civilization and culture of Spain, as well as her political system, settled into rigid forms to await only the inevitable process of stagnation and decay. In her proudest hour, an old soldier, who had lost one of his hands fighting her battles against the Turk at Lepanto, employed the other in writing the masterpiece of her literature, which is really a caricature of the nation. There is much in the career of Spain that calls to mind the dazzling beauty of her dark-glancing daughters, with its early bloom, its startling, almost morbid brilliance, and its premature decay. Rapid and brilliant was her rise, gradual and inglorious her steady decline, from the bright morning when the banners of Castile and Aragon were flung triumphantly from the battlements of the Alhambra, to the short summer, not so long gone, when at Cavite and Santiago, with swift, decisive havoc, the last ragged remnants of the once world-dominating power were blown into space and time, to hover disembodied there, a lesson and a warning to future generations. Whatever her final place in the records of mankind, whether as the pioneer of modern civilization or the buccaneer of the nations, or, as would seem most likely, a goodly mixture of both, she has at least, with the exception only of her great mother, Rome, furnished the most instructive lessons in political pathology yet recorded, and the advice to students of world progress to familiarize themselves with her history is even more apt today than when it first issued from the encyclopedic mind of Macaulay nearly a century ago. Hardly had she reached the zenith of her power when the disintegration began, and one by one her brilliant conquests dropped away to leave her alone in her faded splendor, with naught but her wanting pride left, another Niobe of nations. In the countries more in contact with the trend of civilization and more susceptible to revolutionary influences from the mother country, this separation came from within, while in the remoter parts the archaic and outgrown system dragged along until a stronger force from without destroyed it. Nowhere was the crystallization of form and principle more pronounced than in religious life, which fastened upon the mother country a deadening weight that hampered all progress, and in the colonies, notably in the Philippines, virtually converted her government into a hagiarchy that had its face towards the past, and either could not or would not move with the current of the times. So, when the shot heard round the world, the declaration of humanity's right to be and to become in its all-encircling sweep reached the lands controlled by her, it was coldly received and blindly rejected by the governing powers, and there was left only the slower, subtler, but none the less sure process of working its way among the people, to burst in time in rebellion and the destruction of the conservative forces that would repress it. In the opening years of the 19th century, the friar orders of the Philippines had reached the apogee of their power and usefulness. Their influence was everywhere felt and acknowledged, while the country still prospered under the effects of the vigorous and progressive administration of Anda and Vargas in the preceding century. Native levies had fought loyally under Spanish leadership against Dutch and British invaders, or in suppressing local revolts among their own people, which were always due to some specific grievance, never directed definitely against the Spanish sovereignty. The Philippines were shut off from contact with any country but Spain, and even this communication was restricted and carefully guarded. There was an elaborate central government which, however, hardly touched the life of the native peoples, who were guided and governed by the parish priests, each town being in a way an independent entity. Of this halcyon period, just before the process of disintegration began, there has fortunately been left a record which may be characterized as the most notable Spanish literary production relating to the Philippines, being the calm, sympathetic, judicial account of one who had spent his manhood in the work there, and who, full of years and experience, sat down to tell the story of their life. In it, there are no puerile whinings, no querulous curses that tropical Malays do not order their lives as the people of the Spanish village where he may have been reared, no selfish laments of ingratitude over blessings unasked and only imperfectly understood by the natives, no fatuous self-deception as to the real conditions, but a patient consideration of the difficulties encountered, the good accomplished, and the unavoidable evils incident to any human work. The country and the people, too, are described with the charming simplicity of the eyes that see clearly, the brain that ponders deeply, and the heart that beats sympathetically. Through all the pages of his account runs the quiet strain of peace and contentment, of satisfaction with the existing order, for he had looked upon the creation and saw that it was good. There is neither haste, nor hate, nor anger, but the deliberate recital of the facts, warmed and illuminated by the geniality of a soul to whom age and experience had brought, not a sour cynicism, but the mellowing influence of a ripened philosophy. He was such an old man as may fondly be imagined walking through the streets of Parañaque in stately benignity amid the fear and respect of the brown people over whom he watched. But in all his chronicle there is no suggestion of anything more to hope for, anything beyond. Beautiful as the picture is, it is that of a system which had reached maturity, a condition of stagnation, not of growth. In less than a decade, the terrific convulsions in European politics made themselves felt even in the remote Philippines, and then began the gradual drawing away of the people from their rulers, blind gropings and erratic wanderings at first, but nevertheless persistent and vigorous tendencies. The first notable influence was the admission of representatives for the Philippines into the Spanish Cortes under the revolutionary governments and the abolition of the trade monopoly with Mexico. The last galleon reached Manila in 1815, and soon foreign commercial interests were permitted, in a restricted way, to enter the country. Then, with the separation of Mexico and the other American colonies from Spain, A more marked change was brought about in that direct communication was established with the mother country, and the absolutism of the hierarchy first questioned by the numbers of peninsular Spaniards who entered the islands to trade, some even to settle and rear families there. These also affected the native population in the larger centers by the spread of their ideas, which were not always in conformity with those that for several centuries the friars had been inculcating into their wards. Moreover, there was a not considerable portion of the population, sprung from the friars themselves, who were eager to adopt the customs and ideas of the Spanish immigrants. The suppression of many of the monasteries in Spain in 1835 caused a large influx of the disestablished monks into the Philippines in search for a haven and a home, thus bringing about a conflict with the native clergy, who were displaced from their best holdings to provide berths for the newcomers. At the same time, the increase of education among the native priests brought the natural demand for more equitable treatment by the Spanish friar, so insistent that it even broke out into open rebellion in 1843 on the part of a young Tagalog who thought himself aggrieved in this respect. Thus the struggle went on, with stagnation above and some growth below, so that the governors were ever getting further away from the governed, and for such a movement there is in the course of nature but one inevitable result, especially when outside influences are actively at work, penetrating the social system and making for better things. Among these influences, 4 cumulative ones may be noted: the spread of journalism, the introduction of steamships into the Philippines, the return of the Jesuits, and the opening of the Suez Canal. The printing press entered the islands with the conquest, but its use had been strictly confined to religious works until about the middle of the past century, when there was a sudden awakening, and within a few years 5 journals were being published. In 1848 appeared the first regular newspaper of importance, El Diario de Manila, and about a decade later the principal organ of the Spanish Filipino population, El Comercio, which, with varying vicissitudes, has continued down to the present. While rigorously censored, both politically and religiously, and accessible to only an infinitesimal portion of the people, they still performed the service of letting a few rays of light into the Cimmerian intellectual gloom of the time and place. With the coming of steam navigation, communication between the different parts of the islands was facilitated and trade encouraged, with all that such a change meant in the way of breaking up the old isolation and tending to a common understanding. Spanish power, too, was for the moment more firmly established, and Moro piracy in Luzon and Bisayan Islands, which had been so great a drawback to the development of the country, was forever ended. The return of the Jesuits produced 2 general results tending to dissatisfaction with the existing order. To them was assigned the missionary field of Mindanao, which meant the displacement of the Recollect Fathers in the missions there, and for these other berths had to be found. Again, the native clergy were the losers in that they had to give up their best parishes in Luzon, especially around Manila and Cavite, so the breach was further widened and the soil sown with discontent. But more far-reaching than this immediate result was the educational movement inaugurated by the Jesuits. The native, already feeling the vague impulses from without and stirred by the growing restlessness of the times, here saw a new world open before him. A considerable portion of the native population in the larger centers, who had shared in the economic progress of the colony, were enabled to look beyond their daily needs and to afford their children an opportunity for study and advancement, a condition and a need met by the Jesuits for a time. With the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, communication with the mother country became cheaper, quicker, surer, so that a large number of Spaniards, many of them in sympathy with the Republican movements at home, came to the Philippines in search of fortunes and generally left half-caste families who had imbibed their ideas. Native boys who had already felt the intoxication of such learning as the schools of Manila afforded them began to dream of greater wonders in Spain, now that the journey was possible for them. So began the definite movements that led directly to the disintegration of the friar regime. In the same year occurred the revolution in the mother country, which had tired of the old corrupt despotism. Isabella II was driven into exile, and the country left to waver about uncertainly for several years, passing through all the stages of government, from red radicalism to absolute conservatism, finally adjusting itself to the middle course of constitutional monarchism. During the effervescent and ephemeral republic, there was sent to the Philippines a governor who set to work to modify the old system and establish a government more in harmony with modern ideas and more democratic in form. These changes were hailed with delight by the growing class of Filipinos who were striving for more consideration in their own country, and who, in their enthusiasm and the intoxication of the moment, perhaps became more radical than was safe under the conditions, surely too radical for their religious guides watching and waiting behind the veil of the temple. In January 1872, an uprising occurred in the naval arsenal at Cavite, with a Spanish non-commissioned officer as one of the leaders. From the meager evidence now obtainable, this would seem to have been a purely local mutiny over the service questions of pay and treatment, but in it the friars saw their opportunity. It was blazoned forth with all the wild panic that was to characterize the actions of the governing powers from that time on as the premature outbreak of a general insurrection under the leadership of the native clergy, and rigorous repressive measures were demanded. 3 native priests, notable for their popularity among their own people, one an octogenarian and the other 2 young canons of the Manila Cathedral, were summarily garroted, along with the renegade Spanish officer who had participated in the mutiny. No record of any trial of these priests has ever been brought to light. The archbishop, himself a secular clergyman, stoutly refused to degrade them from their holy office, and they wore their sacerdotal robes at the execution, which was conducted in a hurried, fearful manner. At the same time, a number of young Manilans who had taken conspicuous part in the liberal demonstrations were deported to the Ladrone Islands or to remote islands of the Philippine group itself. This was the beginning of the end. Yet there immediately followed the delusive calm which ever precedes the fatal outburst, lulling those marked for destruction to a delusive security. The 2 decades following were years of quiet, unobtrusive growth, during which the Philippine Islands made the greatest economic progress in their history. But this in itself was preparing the final catastrophe, for if there be any fact well established in human experience, it is that with economic development, the power of organized religion begins to wane. The rise of the merchant spells the decline of the priest. A sordid change from masses and mysteries to sugar and shoes. This is often said to be, but it should be noted that the epochs of greatest economic activity have been those during which the generality of mankind have lived fuller and freer lives, and above all that, in such eras, the finest intellects and the greatest souls have been developed. Nor does such an institution that has been slowly growing for 3 centuries, molding the very life and fibre of the people, disintegrate without a violent struggle, either in its own constitution or in the life of the people trained under it. Not only the ecclesiastical, but also the social and political system of the country was controlled by the religious orders, often silently and secretly, but nonetheless effectively. This is evident from the ceaseless conflict that went on between the religious orders and the Spanish political administrators, who were at every turn thwarted in their efforts to keep the government abreast of the times. The shock of the affair of 1872 had apparently stunned the Filipinos, but it had at the same time brought them to the parting of the ways and induced a vague feeling that there was something radically wrong which could only be righted by a closer union among themselves. They began to consider that their interests and those of the governing powers were not the same. In these feelings of distrust toward the friars, they were stimulated by the great numbers of immigrant Spaniards who were then entering the country, many of whom had taken part in the republican movements at home, and who, upon the restoration of the monarchy, no doubt thought it safer for them to be at as great a distance as possible from the throne. The young Filipinos studying in Spain came from different parts of the islands, and by their association there in a foreign land were learning to forget their narrow sectionalism. Hence, the way was being prepared for some concerted action. Thus, aided and encouraged by the anti-clerical Spaniards in the mother country, there was growing up a new generation of native leaders who looked towards something better than the old system. It is with this period in the history of the country, the author's boyhood, that the story of Noli Tangere deals. Typical scenes and characters are sketched from life with wonderful accuracy, and the picture presented is that of a mastermind who knew and loved his subject. Terror and repression were the order of the day, with ever-growing unrest in the higher circles, while the native population at large seemed to be completely cowed. Brutalized is the term repeatedly used by RIZAL in his political essays. Spanish writers of the period, observing only the superficial movements, some of which were indeed fantastical enough, for they, who in oppression's darkness could have dwelt, they are not eagles nourished with the day. What marvel then, at times, if they mistake their way? And not heeding the currents at work below, take great delight in ridiculing the pretensions of the young men seeking advancement, while they indulge in coarse ribaldry over the wretched condition of the great mass of the Indians. The author, however, himself a miserable Indian, vividly depicts the unnatural conditions and dominant characters produced under the outworn system of fraud and force, at the same time presenting his people as living, feeling, struggling individuals, with all the frailties of human nature and all the possibilities of mankind, either for good or evil. Incidentally, he throws into marked contrast the despicable deprecation used by the Spanish writers in referring to the Filipinos, making clear the application of the self-evident proposition that no ordinary human being in the presence of superior force can very well conduct himself as a man, unless he be treated as such. The friar orders, deluded by the transient triumph and secure in their pride of place, became more arrogant, more domineering than ever. In the general administration, the political rulers were at every turn thwarted, their best efforts frustrated, and if they ventured too far, their own security threatened. For in the three-cornered wrangle, which lasted throughout the whole of the Spanish domination, the friar orders had, in addition to the strength derived from their organization and their wealth, the Damoclean weapon of control over the natives to hang above the heads of both governor and archbishop. The curates in the towns, always the real rulers, became veritable despots, so that no voice dared to raise itself against them, even in the midst of conditions which the humblest Indio was beginning to feel dumbly to be perverted and unnatural, and that too after 3 centuries of training under the system that he had ever been taught to accept as the will of God. The friars seemed long since to have forgotten those noble aims that had meant so much to the founders and early workers of their orders, if indeed the great majority of those of the later day had ever realized the meaning of their office, for the Spanish writers of the time delight in characterizing them as the meanest of the Spanish peasantry, when not something worse, who had been lassoed, taught a few ritualistic prayers, and shipped to the Philippines to be placed in isolated towns as lords and masters of the native population, with all the power and prestige over a docile people that the sacredness of their holy office gave them. These writers treat the matter lightly, seeing in it rather a huge joke on the miserable Indians, and give the friars great credit for patriotism, a term which in this connection they dragged from depth to depth, until it quite aptly fitted Dr. Johnson's famous definition, the last refuge of a scoundrel. In their conduct, the religious corporations, both as societies and as individuals, must be estimated according to their own standards. The application of any other criterion would be palpably unfair. They undertook to hold the native in subjection, to regulate the essential activities of his life according to their ideas, so upon them must fall the responsibility for the conditions finally attained. To destroy the freedom of the subject, and then attempt to blame him for his conduct, is a paradox into which the learned men often fell, perhaps inadvertently through their deductive logic. They endeavored to shape the lives of their Malay wards, not only in this existence, but also in the next. Their vows were poverty, chastity, and obedience. The vow of poverty was early regulated to the limbo of neglect. Only a few years after the founding of Manila, royal decrees began to issue on the subject of complaints received by the king over the usurpation of lands on the parts of the priest. Using the same methods so familiar in the heyday of the institution of monasticism in Europe, pious gifts, deathbed bequests, pilgrims' offerings, the friar orders gradually secured the richest of the arable lands in the more thickly settled portions of the Philippines, notably the part of Luzon occupied by the Tagalogs. Not always, however, it must in justice be recorded, were such doubtful means resorted to, for there were instances where the missionary was the pioneer, gathering about himself a band of devoted natives and plunging into the unsettled parts to build up a town with its fields around it, which would later become a friar estate. With the accumulated incomes from these estates and the fees for religious observances that poured into their treasuries, the orders, in their nature of perpetual corporations, became the masters of the situation, the lords of the country. But this condition was not altogether objectionable. It was in the excess of their greed that they went astray, for the native peoples had been living under this system through generations, and not until they began to feel that they were not receiving fair treatment did they question the authority of a power which not only secured them a peaceful existence in this life, but also assured them eternal felicity in the next. With only the shining exceptions that are produced in any system, no matter how false its premises or how decadent it may become, to uphold faith in the intrinsic soundness of human nature, the vow of chastity was never much more than a myth. Through the tremendous influence exerted over a fanatically religious people who implicitly followed the teachings of the Reverend Fathers, once their confidence had been secured, the curate was seldom to be gainsaid in his desires. By means of the secret influence in the confessional and the more open political power wielded by him, the fairest was his to command, and the favored one and her people looked upon the choice more as an honor than otherwise, for besides the social standing that it gave her, there was the proud prospect of becoming the mother of children who could claim kinship with the dominant race. The curate's companion, or the sacristan's wife, was a power in the community. Her family was raised to a place of importance and influence among their own people, while she and her ecclesiastical offspring were well cared for. On the death or removal of the curate, it was almost invariably found that she had been provided with a husband or protector and a not inconsiderable amount of property, an arrangement rather appealing to a people among whom the means of living have ever been so insecure. That this practice was not particularly offensive to the people among whom they dwelt may explain the situation, but to claim that it excuses the friars approaches dangerously close to casuistry. Still, as long as this arrangement was decently and moderately carried out, there seems to have been no great objection, nor from a worldly point of view, with all the conditions considered, could there be much. But the old story of excess, of unbridled power turned toward bad ends, again recurs at the same time that the ideas brought in by the Spaniards, who come each year in increasing numbers, and the principles observed by the young men studying in Europe cast upon the fitness of such a state of affairs. As they approached their downfall, like all mankind, the friars became more open, more insolent, more shameless in their conduct. The story of Maria Clara, as told in Noli Tangere, is by no means an exaggerated instance, but rather one of the few clean enough to bear the light, and her fate, as depicted in the epilogue, is said to be based upon an actual occurrence with which the author must have been familiar. The vow of obedience, whether considered as to the Pope, their highest religious authority, or to the King of Spain, their political liege, might not always be so callously disregarded, but it could be evaded and defied. From the Vatican came bull after bull, from the Escorial, decree after decree, only to be archived in Manila, sometimes after a hollow pretense of compliance. A large part of the records of Spanish domination is taken up with the wearisome quarrels that went on between the Archbishop, representing the head of the Church, over the questions of the episcopal visitation and the enforcement of the provisions of the Council of Trent, relegating the monks to their original status of missionaries, with the friars invariably victorious in their contentions. Royal decrees ordering inquiries into the titles to the estates of the men of poverty and those providing for the education of the natives in Spanish were merely sneered at and left to moulder in harmless quiet. Not without good grounds for his contention, the friar claimed that the Spanish dominion over the Philippines depended upon him, and he therefore confidently set himself up as the best judge of how that dominion could be maintained. Thus, there are presented in the Philippines of the closing quarter of the century just past the phenomena so frequently met with in modern society, so disheartening to the people who must drag out their lives under them, of an old system which has outworn its usefulness and is being called into question, with forces actively at work disintegrating it, Yet, with the unhappy folk, bred and reared under it, unprepared for a new order of things. The old faith was breaking down. Its forms and beliefs, once so full of life and meaning, were being sharply examined. Doubt and suspicion were the order of the day. Moreover, it must ever be borne in mind that in the Philippines this unrest, except in the parts where the friars were the landlords, was not general among the people, the masses of whom were still sunk in their loved Egyptian night, but affected only a very small proportion of the population, for the most part young men who were groping their way towards something better, yet without any very clearly conceived idea of what that better might be, and among whom was to be found the usual sprinkling of sunshine patriots and omnipresent opportunists, ready for any kind of trouble that will afford them a chance to rise. Add to the apathy of the masses, dragging out their vacant lives amid the shadows of religious superstition, and to the unrest of the few, the fact that the orders were in absolute control of the political machinery of the country, with the best part of the agrarian wealth amortized in their hands. Add also the ever-present jealousies, petty feuds and racial hatreds for which Manila and the Philippines, with their medley of creeds and races, offer such a fertile land, all fostered by the governing class for the maintenance of the old Machiavellian principle of divide and rule, and the sum is about the most miserable condition under which any portion of mankind ever tried to fulfill nature's inexorable laws of growth.